this is going to be kind of a different class than usual. We are not going to be talking about science, which is interesting. Although we are going to be talking about science by not talking about it, because we're going to explore other ways of understanding the cosmos. And I'm really glad that we made it through most of the material from the textbook last class, because we didn't really have a slot to talk about these things this semester. And I think it's really, really important. And so, what I want to do, I'm very quickly going to recap what we talked about last time with the ISM and the cycle of material, which we got a little squeezed out of at the end of last class. But, I think a very valid question is, why do people care about the stars, right? And I've made some case to you for how technologically it's important, right? And most science these days seems to be motivated by technology. And that's all well and good. But if you go way back, what's really fascinating, I'm going to make the case for you that people have cared about stars way longer than they've cared about technology. And so that's something that we need to really explore. So I don't have the answer to that, but maybe by the time that we get through exploring some ideas, in particular, I want to walk through maybe two examples of how some different ancient traditions have interpreted the stars, and see if we can't understand a bit about how that could be useful to us today in our world. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the story of this guy. This is Andromeda. I guess it's a her. But Andromeda was a constellation before we realized it was another galaxy. Which brings up a really interesting point. People didn't think there were other galaxies besides ours until about 100 years ago, which is pretty shocking. So if you think about it, all we thought the universe consisted of was the stars around us for most of human history. And this has radically changed how we think about things. And actually, the standard cosmology that we embrace today was developed in a world in which the center of the universe was our own galaxy. And it was thought that the galaxy was the entire universe. And so it's really interesting that some of the most ancient narratives concern other galaxies, right, which they thought of as stars at the time, and they turned out not to be. So that's going to be interesting. So let's explore that question, why people care about stars. But before we can do that, I think we have to convince ourselves that people did care about the stars. And so I want to walk through some pieces of evidence that the very ancient people were absolutely obsessed with the stars. And that'll put us on good footing to think about why that was. All right. And real briefly, we'll review the cycles. Okay, so from last time, I just want to review this cycle for you, just so that you get a grip on where all this material is coming, where it's going, because what we're going to move into next week is the birth of stars, which will lead us into the full story of the death of stars, and then all of this material will hopefully converge into a story. And like all stories, this one is sure to change, but this is our best story as scientists that we have right now. Along those lines, by the way, I don't know if you've ever really thought about it, but almost everything that happens in the world to you is a story. It's almost inconceivable to grasp some series of events without a narrative to it. I think that's critical, because scientists often have this way of especially looking at things in this technological lens where we concern ourselves with material interactions that are occurring. Now, those are really important, and I do think that this is valuable in and of itself, but we can get into the mindset where we start thinking that things that aren't material interactions aren't real. And by the end of this discussion, I hope that we can converge on an understanding that actually the stories that we tell ourselves are just as real, and they factor in just as much to the things that happen on our planet as do the material interactions that we would generally approach with scientific means. So let's think about stories as we go forward. And ultimately, even though scientists don't really think about it too much, the theories that they tell are essentially stories. Of course, they substantiate them with experimentation and observation, but ultimately a theory is a story of how something works, right? And people have been telling stories since as long as there were human beings, which is a long time. We're talking potentially million years plus. It's hard to say when the first human actually popped onto the scene, or what makes a human, as opposed to just an upright ape without fur on its body. So, okay. The total amount of material, just to recap what we did last class, the total mass of that interstellar medium is this constant competition between the grabbing of interstellar and intergalactic gas and material, and also the escape of that material, right? So there is actually a relay of material between all of the different galaxies, which is quite fascinating. And now that we've moved past the idea that our galaxy is the center of the universe, and we're starting to look at other galaxies, we're seeing that they're actually networked into this really beautiful filamentary structure, which I think can probably tell us a bit about how things are even organized on the atomic level as well, right? So we've moved away from thinking about things as separate from one another, and everything seems to be connected and interacting, and this plays out very much in the cycle of material through the universe. So remember, stars fuse the heavy elements from lighter ones, and they generate power in the process. And as they grow, they lose some of that material into interstellar space. Most of that's hydrogen and helium. Some of those bigger chunks can nucleate dust. Ices can nucleate dust. There's condensation in the cool areas, and we've only recently been able to detect these clouds, right? Because often they're optically transparent, and we have to use radio waves to study them, or different means that weren't really available to even the early 20th century astronomers. So the understanding of the fact that so much of our galaxy isn't stars is really shocking, I think, and a new idea. And this is going to play into our story of the cycle of stars, which we'll work towards. All right, so enough of that. Let's think about the ancients for a little bit. So how far back do we have evidence that people were watching the skies with a very curious eye? It seems like we missed some of the clues originally. So what you see here is a carving from a mammoth tusk, and this is from about 32,500 years ago. That's a long time, right? This is long before any of our early civilizations. Some of the first civilizations we're going to talk about were, at best, best case scenario, were 5,000 BC, so let's say 7,000 years ago, in Mesopotamia and in the Indus Valley and in China. But this is 30,000 years earlier, almost, okay? And because of the fact that the record is so spotty, it's hard to tell what people were doing when they were living back then, what it was like to be alive. But we do have a few little pieces. Now, one thing that you're going to see occurring over and over again as we go through all this evidence is that the early cultures all associated celestial objects with gods and spirits, and they related those objects to things that were happening on Earth, right? Things like the rain cycles and droughts and seasons and tides, right? They were trying to find order upon the chaos that was presented to them. And the stories that they told in the skies helped them to negotiate and navigate those crises, right? I think one of the central themes here is that the most difficult thing that you'll ever experience in life is something which upends your order, something which upends the predictable rhythm of life, right? Now, this could be a new relationship, right? It could be positive, it could be negative, but anytime that we experience something jarring, we're kind of thrown into the sea of chaos again for a whole new time. And I think this is like the central story of being a human being, right? You work things out, everything makes sense, and then nothing makes sense all of a sudden. And so the central question time and time again seems to be, what do you do when that happens, right? How do you process that information in a way that doesn't leave you a complete nervous wreck? And I think that most of the stories that we're going to talk about concern themselves with some aspect of that or another. And so when we think about these ancient peoples, imagining gods in the sky, we have to really think about what that means. What was a god to these people? And I think that it was something a bit more, a lot more than a superstitious, supernatural entity, right? Which is generally the way that we've learned to think about these ancient peoples is, well, they weren't that sophisticated, they didn't understand how things work, and so, yeah, they thought there was ghouls and ghosts and all of these things, right? But I don't think that that's the proper way of thinking about it, actually. I think the truth of the matter is that we all have different, Jung talked about this a lot, Carl Jung, who was a fantastic psychoanalyst. He had this idea that actually, each one of us has a personality, right? But you could break those personalities down into different sub-personalities. And so each one of us might be, a sea of hundreds of different personalities. And I think that's a valid way of looking at it, because if you've ever been angry or in love or had been possessed by any series of common emotions, you get the sense that you're not the one who's necessarily acting it out. Something is happening inside of you which is out of your control. I mean, think about the first time that you had a romantic relationship and just how it absolutely took over your mind and your heart and your whole life, right? And I think what the ancients would say is that, this spirit of, let's say, Venus, right? In many traditions, there was this association with romantic love, in particular associated with Venus, that you were possessed by that god, right? Now, I don't think that that's just a supernatural supposition. I think that there's something truth to that. Rage is another one too. If you've ever just been super pissed off, someone cut you off in traffic or whatever, all of a sudden you find yourself acting without even thinking, right? And it feels good, by the way, to be possessed by these spirits, right? It feels absolutely relaxing to just let yourself go on autopilot and respond to something without having to think about it for the first time. If you've ever been in a quarrel with somebody and you just find yourself cut loose, right? You just tell them exactly what you think all of a sudden. Now, you might feel bad about that later, but at the time it feels super good, right? And I think this is close to what the ancient peoples meant by gods. I think they meant that we had these inherent human emotion circuits, these programs that would play out by themselves. And so as we go through this, I want you to try to imagine these peoples as actually trying to integrate these processes that were happening. And not only that, but also concoct a way to analyze those ways, those emotions in such a way that they could subsume them into their own personality and take control of them. Because what happens if you let rage completely dominate? Well, you end up back in chaos, right? People are killing each other, it escalates, you get wars, all sorts of bad things happen if you don't have a way of actually taking control over those spirits. And so I think that a lot of these ancient religions, if you could call them that, I think they're actually more like moral frameworks for existing, for their society operating, something close to what we have in law today. The purpose of those was really to help people find their way as a community through these different spirits which would possess you from time to time. And they still do, we just don't talk about them the same way. And it's worth mentioning that there wasn't really a distinction at that point between law and religion. They were the same concept, and we can break down what that word religion means a bit later, but there's some evidence that it contains the concept of binding you to some behavioral set of actions, right? So anyways, I would ask you to try to put it out of your mind that these were simple, unsophisticated people, and actually think to yourself, someone asked me the other day, do you think that humans have gotten more, A, intelligent over time, and B, have we gotten more wise since 32,000 years ago? That's a really hard question, right? Because if you define intelligence as the ability to make new concepts, right, to relate different ideas together or to come up with new ideas, then you might say that our overall sea of concepts has gotten bigger, more information, we're able to integrate it more, so perhaps we're a more intelligent species than we used to be. I think there's a case for that. But what is wisdom exactly, right? Wisdom seems to be something akin to learned experience about how to actually act in the world so as to ensure the most positive outcome for your life. And I think that goes far beyond survival. And what's interesting is, as you start to see these patterns and these stories that people were telling themselves, they're so similar to the same problems we face today, it's hard to actually make a claim that we're much more wise than we used to be. Now, we have found a way to have less war on the planet than we've ever had. Certainly people are living longer. We've done away with a lot of the hardships of starvation and complete abject poverty. I think something like 7 out of the 8 billion people on Earth today are not living in complete extreme poverty, and that's brand new. So maybe we have gained some wisdom, but I don't think it's as much as we're probably tempted to believe. So anyways, back to this tablet thing here. So what's going on? Well, of course, people looked at this at first and they're like, oh, okay, just like an ancient stone carving. It's kind of a shoddy sculpture of a man standing there. One of his legs is kind of short. These people were just primitive. They didn't know what they were doing. This gentleman, I'm going to mess up his name, Dr. Michael Rapin-Leeuwik, started analyzing the different markings that were on here. And it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but there's little dots all along this gentleman's body. And what he found was that the constellation Orion, which you've probably all seen, it's one of the most obvious constellations in the sky. If you don't know any other constellations, you can probably pick this one out. It's got 3 really bright stars in a line, essentially, and that's the belt of Orion. And Orion, of course, comes from a much later myth. But the ancients seem to have been paying attention because the different markings on this figure actually corresponded exactly not only to this, not just to the stars in the sky as we see them today, but if we trace back the motion of the stars, which we can view today, the stars were in a different location back then, right? Very subtly, but it turns out that this particular carving was able to replicate where scientists have deduced by calculating where those stars in Orion would have been at that time. So it was quite clear that people were thinking about the stars and using them for whatever purposes at the time, but they certainly saw a human being in the stars, right? They were already at the point where they were using the stars, at the very least, to tell stories about what was happening on Earth. And this is stunning, if for no other reason than how far back it goes. So another interesting thing is when they looked at the backside of this tablet, they analyzed these different notches, right? It seemed to be some system of record keeping on the back. And they found that there was 86 notches on the back. And they found that the number 86 actually happens to be the number of days in the human pregnancy, the gestation period for the human being. This is pretty shocking, right? So it seems like people were starting to, and this is an important thing to keep track of too, right? You want to know when your child's going to be born. Maybe you're going to even plan that pregnancy, which is freaking crazy if you think about people 32,000 years ago having the wherewithal to plan their pregnancies in advance, right? And so many of these modern ideas we find situated in the deep past. Unfortunately, our historic record only goes back maybe 5, 6, 7,000 years. But we get little glimpses like this, and most of the material that people were probably writing on back then is completely gone. This is a bone carving, but you guys probably don't take notes in bone, right? That's not a very, it might be long-lived, but it's not necessarily the best way of going about things. So if they were writing on, with chalk on the wall, if they were writing on tablets with chalk, if they were using anything like paper, we would have no idea. Yeah. Oh, they essentially have made a chart on the back of this bone, this tusk, to chart out the pregnancy. That's the hypothesis anyways. Could be a complete coincidence. But, it's an interesting hypothesis. So 2 pieces of really interesting information there. At any rate, it seems like people were very analytical that far back, which is, I think, very difficult for people to grasp. There's also the argument that that much time has the ability to erase so much history. There's a gentleman that published, well, 2 gentlemen I actually had the chance to sit down with both of them. One is the director of the Goddard Institute of Space Science, which is actually located in New York City. His name is Gavin Schmidt. And Gavin and this other dude, Adam Frank, published a paper where they investigated the possibility that, hey, if there was a fairly sophisticated civilization, maybe not one with cars and trains, but let's say something closer to Mesopotamia, something like that. If that were to exist in the deep past, let's say tens and tens of thousands of years ago, and let's say, like our industrial civilization, which has only been around for 300 years, that industrial civilization also only lasted for a few hundred years, would we be able to even know about it? And their conclusion was absolutely not. We would probably have no record of it whatsoever. And so it's really important when we look at the past and we look at the very spotty pieces of information that we have, that to realize that we don't know the whole story. In fact, we might be missing really big pieces of it. So science tends to be a very conservative discipline. We look at the facts that we can see, and we make stories out of the facts that we can see. Now, if we can't see facts, they can't come into our story by definition. That doesn't mean that they're not there. It just means that we're limited by the things we can see. And unfortunately, in the deep past, we don't have much information at all. It gets even worse when you start looking at fossils from millions of years ago, because sometimes there's huge pieces of the fossil record missing. Like there's a piece of the geologic history where 1 billion years is missing, just gone, right? What happened in that 1 billion years? No one knows. It's very, very crazy. And if you go to the Grand Canyon, you can see this big missing piece of history. There's just a band that's absent, right, of 1 billion years of time. And so what I'm trying to impress upon you is just that whatever stories we are able to tell ourselves about the past, they're inherently incomplete. They could be wildly incomplete, as a matter of fact. And so I think that's worth considering when we expand our mind about how sophisticated these ancient peoples were. My sense is that they may have been very sophisticated, just as sophisticated as you or I. They probably had mathematics and language and everything else, advanced language, poetry, art, music, all sorts of things. Actually, I didn't put this in the slides, but some of the most ancient artifacts that we have are of musical instruments, actually. So these weren't dummies. These weren't just simpletons. All right. So another very beautiful piece of evidence that people were staring at the stars comes from this cave painting, which is a very famous cave painting. It's one of the oldest. It's from a cave in France, actually. What's interesting is people, again, this painting's much bigger, and it has all sorts of things. There's bulls and horses and antelope, and of course, the first archaeologists who were discovering this thought, okay, they were great. These people, they liked art. Maybe they were telling stories on the walls. But somebody came along and looked at it a little closer. Actually, it was the same gentleman that looked at this other piece. And again, he started looking at the different dots that were on here. And he thought, you know what, I don't think these are accidental markings. And sure enough, when you correlate these dots to the star maps as the stars would have appeared in the sky to these peoples, and this is from 16,500 years ago. Again, you see a very sophisticated map here. There's this kind of strange-looking man up here. There's a little bird on a stick, and then there's this bullhead. And what he found is that the Birdman and the bird represented the three prominent stars of Vega, Deneb, and Altar, which are popularly known as the Summer Triangle. And, it's interesting because this is normally only visible in the northern hemisphere in the summer. But back then, 17,000 years ago, this would have actually been, it would have never set below the horizon at that point, right? Because the stars, the Earth, the solar system was in a different position. And so this was something that escaped the first archaeologists who came to look at it. It's interesting because there's also this painting of the bull which is found, and sure enough, like the bull also contains pieces of stars. We see the Pleiades up there in the corner. We also see, by the way, the Pleiades figure highly into different myths across the culture. We're not going to have time to go into all those, but every single culture has a story about the Pleiades. Have you guys seen the Pleiades? Yeah? All right, somebody has. Have you guys ever seen a Subaru before? So that little cluster of stars on the logo of the Subaru is the Pleiades. And if you look up in the sky, it's almost always visible. You'll see just kind of like a misty region, depending on how good your eyes are. There's like a little cluster. And if you look a little bit closer, you'll actually see that that's a formation of 7 different stars. And so, yeah, people were paying attention. This is remarkable. Another example. This is another piece that was found in 72. This one comes actually from Africa, which is interesting. And the markings on this turned out to align perfectly to the moon's phases, which is quite fascinating. This is also from 35,000 years ago. Okay, so people were paying very close attention to the moon. Now, these are like the only pieces of evidence we have, but I don't think that it was a rare occasion that people were looking at it. I don't think they were exceptions. I think we just don't have much material. So the next piece of material that we really have comes from Scotland. This is called the Warren Field finding, and it's thought that this dates back maybe to 10,000 years ago, 8,000 BC. And it's interesting, they were actually doing an aerial survey of the region, and they noticed that there was these little pits. And so, they started to characterize them. They didn't find anything remarkable, but an astronomer took a look at this and realized that the pits actually lined up really nicely to the shifting lunar cycles, right? The different phases of the moon. And of course, also the solstice was marked on there really nicely. And that's one of the things we see a lot as we go forward after into the actual beyond the Paleolithic, when we start seeing these giant megalithic structures like Stonehenge appearing, right? We start seeing that the timing of the seasons, the calendar, becomes really, really important. Now, I think this was important for 2 reasons. Of course, it's useful to know when to plant your crops, right? And so keeping track of the year became very important, and timekeeping became very important. But I think there's more to it than that as well, right? I think that this regular predictive order was something that people could grab a hold of. It gave them this sense of order to the universe, which was really important in that most of these myths culminate in the ability of some supreme deity to regulate all of the other deities, right? And I think we would call this God today or something like that. But you ask yourself, what is this supreme God thing, right? And I think that if you take the tack that all of these sub-gods are these different pieces of our own personality that possess us from time to time, then the supreme God is the idealized ability to organize those different pieces of yourself into something that's not only functional, but very effective and very, very integrated to the society as a whole, that allows you to function as a community in a way that individuals wouldn't be able to on their own. our ability to organize into communities is, in some sense, quite rare. Of course, you have ants and birds flocking, and there's places where there are social organisms, but none quite as complex and unified as ours, right? I mean, human beings are extraordinarily dangerous animals, right? We all have the ability to just murder the heck out of each other anytime we want, but we don't do it, right? For some reason, we don't do it, because I think that we found that it's actually better for all of us if we don't have to mess with that 100% of the time. And so generally speaking, we're able to sit in this classroom, behave ourselves, and not stab the person next to you, which is actually a really remarkable feat if you think about it. And so I think this principle, these principles of religion helped people organize their behaviors in a way such that they could actually collaborate and build the world that we've seen today. All right. So, these calendars show up everywhere. We see Stonehenge. The Mayans built all of their structures around calendars, built all of their structures. And all these calendars, of course, are referent to the stars, the sun. The Mayans were particularly obsessed with Venus. And I hope that we'll have some time to explore that at the very end, if I don't ramble too much. All right. So moving forward in time a bit further, we get to this artifact, which is found in Germany. This is called the Nebra sky disk. Let's see, about 5,000 BC, so 7,000 years ago. This is a tiny little piece, but of course, it does seem to obviously have stars on it. And when people started investigating these, they realized that it was actually, not only was the Pleiades evident, there's a 7-star cluster up there, but they were actually able to pull out the lunar calendar from these markings along the ring. And this actually addressed one of the first crises in astronomy, which was, hey, the moon seems to come and go every month or so. We would say every 30 days. But the year is not a perfect multiple of that, which was terribly traumatic to most early astronomers, right? You see almost all of the writing and all of the technological power that was going into these calendars was trying to rectify this crisis. How in the world can we look at the moon and know what time of year it is? And so it turns out that you have to come up with this really precise matching of when exactly, how many months does it take for it to actually come around and line up again. And so they think that this information was encoded in this disk, actually, and also in the Warren fields. And I don't have the particular details about that, but you're welcome to check it out on your own. So people were wrestling with these concepts of time, with the regularity, the order of the skies. Okay, so here we have a Bronze Age astronomical observatory. This is in northern Macedonia, about 1900 BC. And again, they're doing the same things that they were doing at the Warren Field. They're studying the motion of the sun and the moon at the same time. They're making different tick marks. They're on top of an old extinct volcano here, and they're trying to find some alignment between the two. And people just absolutely bashed their heads against the wall with this right up until the Greek times, until they actually figured out a calendar that was useful. They also seem to have really been obsessed with the idea that the sun itself could represent this supreme overarching deity, which is, I think that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, the sun is by far the brightest star in the sky, followed by Venus, which would explain why Venus became so prominent, especially in the Mesoamerican traditions. Now, you got to keep in mind, these people didn't think of stars as any different than planets, right? They look the same if you go outside. And I think there's some truth in that. Now, the weird thing about the planet stars, if you want to call them stars for today, is that they don't stay in the same place from night to night. They actually move in strange ways. Because of the fact that when the Earth moves past these stars, sometimes, like let's say Mars, sometimes we move past Mars. Well, if you're looking at the sky, Mars is in front of you, and then all of a sudden, as you pass it, it seems like it's moving backwards for a moment. And then at some point, it moves forwards again, right? This was absolutely perplexing to people. And, it gave the Greeks no small problems in trying to make sense of this. And ultimately, this is what dethroned the idea that the Earth was at the center of this business. Because coming up with a nice model for why the stars would go backwards turned out to be tremendously difficult, to the point that it became untenable, and people abandoned the idea altogether. But at any rate, starting here at Kokino, we get this idea that the central deity of the civilization was pegged to the sun. And we see this reemerge with the Egyptians too, which we'll talk about very briefly. But let's talk about the birthplace of Western astronomy, because essentially we're sitting here in a Western astronomy course. Most of the modern scientific principles are claimed to be derived from Mesopotamia. And I think that's pretty fair. There seems to have been a fair amount of trafficking of ideas between India and possibly even the Far East and Mesopotamia. In fact, the Mesopotamians seem to have sort of showed up out of nowhere, right? Their ethnicity and their language and all of this seems to have appeared on the scene out of nowhere. It's very, very, very strange. The same with the Egyptians, although there's a little bit of evidence that the Egyptians maybe got some of their basic mythology from the Indus Valley originally. But where is Mesopotamia? Yeah, Andrew.
It's like Persia and like the ancient kingdom of like Babylon. It's really the spot. I mean, I know we call the Middle East the Saudi Peninsula as really the Middle East, but if we go even more like to the right towards Iran and Iraq, that's really kind of where like the Eurasia.
Yeah. I mean, it is centered on Iraq and Syria, right? And this is really, really tragic if you think about what's happened to Iraq and Syria in the last couple 20 years. This is the birthplace, the cradle of civilization, right? Much of these beautiful ancient cities, right? A lot of these buildings had stood since then, right? There was temples and sculptures, and most of those have been leveled by the war that's gone on there, which is extraordinarily tragic. I think the tragedy is difficult to overstate. And I think that this is also given a bit of a misleading narrative too, because we see these pictures. If you look at a picture of Syria and Iraq, you might think to yourself, God, why would anybody want to live there? It's just this dusty wasteland, right? But this is actually a moment for us to think about the concept of climate change in general, right? So it definitely didn't look like that 7,000, 5,000 years ago. Actually, these people were coming off of the glaciations, right? The seas were flooding with water. There was torrential rains, okay? So this was kind of one of the cooler pictures I could find of an artist's idea of what ancient Sumeria might have looked like. It was very, very lush. It probably looked a lot like, I don't know, like not something almost tropical, but very, very rich, like the Willamette Valley or something like that. Something very, very rich with tons of farm fields and crops and great intercity commerce. There was all of these different cities that were working together. It was the first time that people actually had the ability to sit around and think professionally. Actually, the Babylonians had a whole compartment of their city, which was called Chaldea, that was devoted to astronomy. So they had a whole class of people, much like we have lawyers or doctors, that were called astronomers, and they were a distinct ethnic group of people, actually, which is really fascinating. So there was some sort of ancient tradition of looking at the stars, and the Sumerian metropolitans brought those people into the fold, and they actually just adopted them into the... It would be like if we had, some ethnic minority that happened to be really good doctors, and we just were like, okay, those are the doctors. That's it. And they lived in one part of town, and that was it. So this was a real metro, it was a real metro area, like New York City or San Francisco or something. There was compartmentalization of labor, and for the first time, it seems like there was a whole dedication to the pursuit of knowledge for the first time, right? We see the birth of anything approaching the idea of an academy, which is really crazy. So this is also when people began compiling the first star catalogs, right? They began to actually make very regular daily measurements of the stars, and they kept that up for hundreds of years. And actually, most of the revelations that were achieved by the Greeks later, let's say 1,000 years later, were dependent upon the catalogs that were generated by the Sumerians, right? They took all that data, much like Kepler took, or much like Newton worked off of Kepler's data, these people took the Sumerians' data and they came up with the ideas that really formed the foundation of Western astronomy and really Western science as a whole. So, there it is. I guess I should have shown this map first, but of course, there you have ancient Sumeria, which is this very fertile river valley area. Also, it's worth considering that the Egypt that you're used to, it drives me nuts when people show pictures of ancient Egypt in this desert. That was not at all what it was like back then, okay? It's very, very important that we remember that the climates on Earth are constantly on the move. This cycle of glaciation and recession of glaciers, this has happened hundreds of times, actually. And so when, people on the street often speak of the last glacier as the Ice Age, that's not really what it is. The Ice Age is a series of glacial and interglacial periods where the glaciers are coming and going and coming and going. And they do this like clockwork every, tens of thousands of years. And this is the climate changing in radical ways. This place down here in Egypt, the Saharan desert, right, the biggest desert on Earth, wasn't always a desert. It wasn't even a desert that long ago. It was a very lush area with seas and lakes and greenery and wild animals, right? It was essentially a giant jungle all the way up until, I think, around 8,000 BC or so. Okay, so the worlds that these people are inhabiting are nothing like the ones that you're going to see if you have the opportunity to go visit them. The world was not like that. And of course, I think that it's wise for us to consider that this is what the Earth does, at least for the last million years or so, maybe several millions of years. Okay, and this wasn't the case at the time of the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs actually didn't experience glacial periods, and that's really interesting because it seems like climate during the time of the dinosaurs was, well, we'll get into a whole other discussion if we play with that, but something was different. Obviously, the animals were enormous, so the world was not as it is now. And I think it's really, really important as we think about as we focus on, especially as we focus on, what are we going to do about the changing climate, And a lot of the solutions that people are brainstorming is like, well, we're going to keep it in check. And I think that that's maybe a little bit, it's not only naive, but I think that it's slightly misguided because the smarter thing to do is to figure out how to roll with the punches, right? If you're fighting a super big giant, you probably you can cut off its arm, but it might grow a new one, right? You're not going to be able to defeat the thing the way that you've been able to attack small problems with your instruments in the past. So, one of the things that I would like to see happening more in the discussion of climate change is that it's probably inevitable. It's always been cycling like this in a very crazy way. Now, perhaps humans have made it worse. There's a great deal of evidence to support that idea, and perhaps we can peel that back. But it's not going to stop the ball from rolling is the thing, right? And so we have to think about how we're going to work with the changing climate and how we're going to adapt to that in the future because, inevitably, the glaciers will reappear in, let's say, 10,000 years or so. And that might seem like a long time, but I personally hope that I hope our civilization lasts that long. It's never happened before, but it's not out of the question. And so I think we have to be prepared for that. Something to think about anyways. All right, so, it's difficult to overestimate the importance of the Babylonian culture on our own sciences, right? Of course, the way that our time is divided, we talked about this briefly, is basically the same system. For whatever reason, we use that same 60s, right? The base 60 is important in the way that we divide up a circle, right? We still divide a circle into degrees, 360 degrees, which is 6 multiples of 60. And we divide, of course, the hour into 60 units, right? It's kind of preposterous, actually, if you look at all the units we use for everything else, which are base 10, and then you think, wow, we're still using this Babylonian method of keeping time and of dividing up the circle, which is just absolutely mind-bending if you think about how impractical it is, but we still cling to it, right? It's hard to shake how important this civilization was upon us. Now, this is also happening in ancient India too, not too distant from this. So about 3rd millennium BCE, so a little bit later, but around the same time. And the Indians were very much concerned with keeping their own records which may have been shared to some extent with the Sumerians. They were tracking the sun and the moon phases. They were beginning to keep star catalogs, which played heavily into the later first millennia AD calculations. Of course, there was amazing revelations in math, in particular, that came out of India much later that depended on a lot of these findings. So we can't discount that. Also, just across the way, briefly over in Egypt, we saw a similar thing happening about the same time. You know, the pyramids themselves were aligned towards the pole star at the time, which wasn't Polaris, right? The pole star actually changes from time to time because the Earth, the pole star is essentially the star which is right over our axis of spin for the planet. But it turns out that the Earth wobbles a little bit every few thousand years, right? And so we'll have a different pole star later than we had today, and different from the one they had back then. So the pole star back then was a star called Thuban, which is in the constellation Draco. And the Egyptians seem to have structured their pyramids and their temples based around the orientation of these stars, which, you know, that makes a lot of sense because it's something that's happening very predictably in the sky. It makes sense, especially if your God system is pegged to this as well. You know, they didn't have YouTube, they didn't have Netflix, so the visual aids they used, they didn't have a projector, right? So if you're going to get up in front of a bunch of people and tell stories, well, of course you're going to have the stars above your head, right? This makes a ton of sense. So astronomy played a huge role in Egypt too, particularly in terms of medicine and ceremony. You know, this helped them they set up all of their religious holidays based around the appearance of different stars, particularly Sirius played a very prominent role in this culture. You know, and the way that they would do this was kind of interesting. They would basically, there would be a priest, and he would set someone in front of him, and he would actually he would set the person directly underneath, let's say, Sirius, and depending on the location of the other stars in the background, he would put different marks on this person, and they would end up being part of the ceremony as a result of that. So certainly these traditions evolved up around the stars. China also, again, very similar situation out there. The Chinese astronomers were particularly fascinated with something they called guest stars. Now, this is fascinating because guest stars turn out to be these variable stars that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, which are these stars that seem to appear and then disappear, right? Their luminosity is changing. And so this is one of the first times that people were actually making observations of variable stars and of supernova too, which we'll get into a bit later. Actually, they were the first people to record a supernova. This was slightly after the turn of the millennium, 185 AD, but they had been observing these sort of behaviors for a long time. So the Mayans, of course, as well. We'll get into those a bit later. I want to make sure that I have time to get into the mythology, but we'll come back to the Mayans. Needless to say, I hope I've impressed upon you at least the basic idea that everybody cared about the stars, right? And so the next question becomes, well, all right, great, they were able to time their crop plantings and all of this, but that's pretty simple to do with essentially just understanding the solstice, which is, you know, one of the first things you'll probably notice is that the sun changes in its height throughout the year. You know, you can time that pretty easily. But there must be something more to that, right? And this brings up the idea, this brings in back to us to this concept of religion in general. You know, almost all of these societies, like I said, had no distinction between religion and law. And initially, they had no distinction between religion, science, and law, which, of course, led to all sorts of confusion, which culminated, of course, in Galileo having this standoff with the Pope, which I think is a bit confused, too, because most people think, okay, Galileo had this finding, the Earth is not at the center of the universe, and the Pope hated him for it. It's not quite like that. Actually, Galileo wrote a book, I think it was called a dialogue concerning two world systems. And yes, he did present the idea that the sun was actually at the center of the solar system, but he actually made fun of the Pope quite a bit in that book, right? He had a character in his book called Simplicus, who who was this kind of idiot and who was hanging on to these old ideas. This is sort of, like making a political cartoon, essentially, right? I think this is the reason the Pope hated him, actually. And I don't think it had anything to do with his scientific theories. But, of course, science and religion would come into stark contrast, and there would be conflict between the two for the next 500 years. Really up to the present, we still see it going on, right? Which is a bit tragic because ultimately science and religion are aimed at two different projects, Science is being asked religious questions at this point, particularly in cosmology. And I think this is a bit of a disservice because science isn't really capable of telling you how to behave. It really can just tell you how things work, right, in the natural world. So, what is religion? Religion is usually defined as a socio-cultural system of designated behaviors and practices, morals, beliefs, worldviews, texts, sanctified places, prophecies, ethics, or organizations that generally relates humanity to supernatural, transcendent, or spiritual elements. But there's not really a scholarly consensus that can put it into one sentence very easily, right? But it all seems to be aimed at discussing what gives life meaning, right? People have been asking the same questions since the beginning of time. Where did I come from? Why am I here? What am I supposed to do with myself? And what's going to happen when I die, right? And these questions are being pointed at science today. But again, maybe that's not the most appropriate channel to go through it. Now, what's interesting is that this idea of religion, it's actually an old French Anglo-Norman word. And it really didn't originally have anything to do with laws or anything. But it was really concerning this idea of moral obligation. Yeah, Travis. Can you rephrase it? Yeah. Oh, in today's modern age, I believe. Oh, yeah. Oh, so maybe that's not obvious enough, right? Questions of, all right, so let's look at what are some of the biggest, hottest topics right now at the edge of science. I would say cosmology, which we generally call Big Bang cosmology, consciousness studies, how in the world do a bunch of cells come together to make this kind of qualitative experience that we have. Questions of, let's just pick apart cosmology for a second. The Big Bang is essentially a creation story, right? It's the same story that every culture has had about the generation of the universe from something out of nothing, right? This is, I don't think most people realize that the Big Bang theory was actually concocted by a Belgian priest, right? Who happened to also be a mathematician. And he was taking a bunch of Hubble's data and basically, it's hard to separate out his motivation, but he had essentially found a way to use this data to show that the universe had an origin point. And we'll get into that later. And so I think it's probably most obvious in cosmology that these questions of where do we come from? Where did this whole place come from? Why is it here? I think that's where we really see it being discussed in that sense. Cosmology was never considered a science until essentially the discovery of the microwave background radiation, where this Belgian priest, his name was Lemaitre, his idea was interesting. It did put some sort of story to this redshift distance relationship, which we'll talk about when we get to cosmology. But it wasn't seriously entertained as science until the discovery of the microwave background radiation, which was very readily embraced as substantiation for this creation story, essentially. And so we've essentially tried, and there's a certain branch of religion that tries very desperately to put physical evidence to their religious stories, right? You see this in very extreme religious cases, particularly like in the extreme religious Christian communities in this country. Which is interesting. It's an interesting idea to think that you're trying to take these mythological ideas and substantiate them as, by supplying evidence for their factuality, as opposed to really just thinking about what they're trying to say to us, which sometimes gets swept under the rug, which is a bit of a tragedy. Does that contextualize it a bit? Okay, cool. I guess what I'm trying to get at with all of this too is that this idea of religion didn't mean what it means today at some point, right? It was more of a system, a moral framework, right? And this is actually something that, the reason that I'm taking all this time to talk about this is because I think that we in the West have never been more in need of a moral framework for operation, right? If you think about it, right? As you grow up, there's pressure on you, depending on your community, you might have a moral framework, you might not. The general social construct that we live under today is oriented towards making you productive, right? Your goal is to make something out of yourself that's successful. You want to make yourself someone who can earn, right? Provide for your family, maybe grow something, grow a business, become well-known, right? These are our value structures right now. Ultimately, if you look at how a country measures its own success, it comes down to GDP growth, right? It comes down to output, productivity, right? These are our gods in the modern civilization, whether we like it or not, right? These are the mythological aspirations of the people. And in the past, I think that people, of course, were oriented towards those things, but they were also oriented towards the celebration of some moral ideal which went beyond that. And I think that's what the original conception of religion was. It wasn't some church with priests who did things. That came much later. The idea that people needed an overarching, unifying morality is something I think that humankind is very desperate for right now, actually. And I don't mean that we should resurrect some ancient religion and, start praying to Marduk or something like that, right? I just mean that we need to think about what do we want what do we want the world to look like 1,000 years from now, right? What does it look like? How do people treat one another 1,000 years from now? How do we treat people who are less prepared, people who are down and out? How do we treat other peoples that might be different from us? What does that look like? And whatever it looks like is probably what we should be orienting ourselves towards culturally and morally. And that's what a unifying morality would look like if we were able to celebrate that vision of where we're headed with all of this. Are we just headed towards making more money? Is that it? Is that all we're here to do? I mean, I'm not trying to answer this question for you. I just think that most people, I'm sure almost everyone in this room could agree that on an interpersonal level, that's not what your lives are about, right? And there's cases that have been made throughout history that all that matters is power, right? And particularly Marx made this case, which was quite popular, because of course the world is full of tyranny, but if you only orient yourself towards growth or towards power, then I think you're missing out a big piece of the picture, and I think that it's going to lead us off a cliff if we're not careful. Because those are very important things to take note of, power dynamics, but they're not really what play out in your everyday life. Look, if you're hanging out with your buddies and all you're obsessing about is who's in power, that's going to be a really, really bad time. You're not going to have very good friends, right? And certainly if you get married or if you have a romantic relationship, if you find yourself exclusively concerned with power dynamics, your marriage is going to last 5 minutes, right? So these aren't real. This isn't really what matters to us on a daily basis, right? And so I think that the ancients were very cognizant of this fact, and they centered it in their societies in a way that, of course, was corrupted by power structures. There was, of course, tyrannical church practices, right? And I think this is why people in the modern rational age have moved away from that. Religions, at least in the developed countries, have never been less popular. And I think that's a reaction to the corruptions that have occurred, because any system does tend towards corruption eventually. Systems decay, institutions decay, they're no longer what they used to be. They're not as potent as they used to be, right? And I'm not saying we need a new institution even. I'm just saying that it's very likely that we need to find a way as a human culture to refocus on things that are human, right? Not just numbers on a page about who has the biggest army, the biggest bank account, right? These turn out to be not that meaningful. If you ask somebody on their deathbed, who's been a billionaire, what was the most important, what are the memories they remember when at the end of their life? It's always about the people, right? It's always about their friends, their family, the experiences they've had. It's never about how they killed this one deal and they or even that they invented this thing or they came up with this scientific idea. It's always about the people. And we don't have a great way of celebrating that as a whole. But I think we'll have to figure it out. I want to get to a central myth here. We talked very briefly about Marx. Marx was one of the first people who actually criticized religion openly. That was absolutely unheard of before Marx. And Marx, I don't know how much you guys have talked about Marx in your other classes, but Marx had a very cynical view of religion, and he called it the opiate of the masses. Actually, I'll read you his quote. He said, "Religious suffering is the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, the soul of soulless conditions. It's the opium of the people." And I think he was reacting to some very real tyranny that he perceived in the world. I think that this was motivated more or less from a good place. But you also have to think about who this guy was, right? This was a very miserable person who was, by all accounts, a very heavy alcoholic. He was incapable of sustaining friendships. His marriages were tumultuous. I think that oftentimes when we make proclamations about society, especially derogatory ones that are critical, we fail to think about our own lives and how those factor into things too. It's very easy to complain about other people and reflect how you actually feel about your own self as you're doing that. There's other people who have criticized this idea that there's anything valuable. Dawkins is a very famous one. The French philosopher Michel Onfray. And these people essentially say that religion's irrational. It's just a holdover from something in the past. And again, there's a case to be made for that. Dawkins went so far to go and say that essentially religion and these superstitious ideas are viruses of the mind, which is, wow, that's quite a proclamation. Very popular podcaster Sam Harris has a lot to say about this as well. I don't know if you guys have listened to this. He wrote that religion is akin to a mental illness. I guess he said this in a podcast, that it allows otherwise normal human beings to reap the fruits of madness and consider them holy. So, wow, these are some harsh words, but they don't really play out as the thing. That's what's really strange about these criticisms. There's been a number of massive studies that have looked at people who embrace religions versus those who don't. There's a very big one. 850 different papers were analyzed. That was a meta review. I don't have the date for this one. This was, I think, in the early 2000s. And they concluded that, quote, "The majority of well-conducted studies found that higher levels of religious involvement are positively associated with indicators of psychological well-being, like life satisfaction, happiness, positive effect, and higher morale, with less depression, suicidal thoughts, behavior, drug and alcohol abuse." Another one from the Pew Research Center in 2019 compared religious people to those that didn't embrace anything religious or spiritual, and found that religious people are more likely to describe themselves as, quote, "very happy," to join other organizations like charities or clubs, to participate in voting, and at the same time, they were less likely to smoke and drink. So it seems like it does actually offer people something that's undeniable. I think it's also worth pointing out that the Soviet Union tried to eradicate religion. They actually made it illegal. They killed off all of the religious priests. But the Soviet Union didn't work out. In fact, in our culture, the worst thing you can call someone is a Nazi, right? Everybody's a Nazi these days, right? If you don't like somebody, they're a Nazi. But, the Nazis, we hate them because they obviously exterminated something like 6 million people of different ethnicities, and they killed Jews, they killed political dissidents, they killed people whose sexual orientation didn't jive with them. 6 million people, that's a lot, right? The Soviets killed 60 million people that they didn't like, right? Based on the idea that, based on Marx's proclamations that all we needed to do was, get rid of these kind of mind viruses. So I think there's something to be said for that. It didn't work out. It wasn't a good idea. All right. So let's work towards the concept of myth, because one of the first things that appears, the way that humans, like I said at the beginning of all this, the way that we understand reality is through stories. And I think there's a case to be made that stories are every bit as real in that they play out the same way over and over again over thousands of years. They're every bit as real as the scientific mechanisms that we describe in terms of our material reality. When I'm telling you these stories about how atoms work and how light is produced, those are very real stories as well. But on Earth, the stories that play out are just as real. And the way that we talk about them, the way that we showcase those stories is through myth. And so the general agreed upon definition for what a myth is something like the beliefs and practices, I'm back to religion again. The basic idea is that people will present these overarching archetypical narratives in the form of stories which are memorable, which can be passed down. And of course, they told these myths under the stars. So I want to basically take apart one myth for you here in our last 10 minutes. I wish I had more time. I know I've been talking a lot. But I want to talk about Andromeda, okay? So the best version of Andromeda we have, maybe, that's best preserved, is found in the Greek tradition. And essentially, to make a long story short, Andromeda is this beautiful princess, right? She's the daughter of, the king and queen of Ethiopia. This is King Cepheus and Cassiopeia. And what happened was that the mother of the beautiful daughter was bragging so much about her beauty that the god of the sea became angry and sent a sea monster to destroy the coast of Ethiopia. And so the king went to the oracles and tried to figure out what he was going to do to save his lands from this onslaught. And the oracle said, well, you just have to sacrifice your daughter. So Andromeda was chained to the rocks at the edge of the sea and left for this sea monster. So then enters the hero of the story, this gentleman named Perseus, who had just fought this terrible battle against Medusa, which is a whole other story by itself. And there's some rich symbolism in that. Anyways, the two see each other, they immediately fall in love. And essentially, Perseus rescues her, and then there's this whole fallout from that, right? Because obviously this wasn't supposed to happen. There's all sorts of jealousy that ensues. And ultimately, there's a quarrel that breaks out at the wedding, and the hero defeats the challenger by essentially showing Medusa's head at the very end, right? It's quite gruesome. And so you ask yourself what this really means. And I think the best way to understand what this means is to look to modern times. How did this myth persist, right? So if we go into the Middle Ages, we find that this idea of the hero showing up to rescue the maiden from a dragon still persists, right? And that story persists popularly in the legend of St. George and the Dragon, which is very much a similar situation, right? Now, there's something that you see happen in both of these stories, and it happens over again, and you see this over and over in all of these different cultures, which is that the civilization, the city, the world, is in this very beautiful state of almost utopian bliss. Everything is figured out. All of a sudden, some sort of monster shows up, right? It's a dragon. It smells bad. It's got terrible breath and fire breathing, and it captures something beautiful and pure. In this case, this princess, right? And then this hero shows up, slays the dragon, and everything goes back to normal, right? Now, this actually plays out so often in our stories, and we still see it, right? This is essentially the dragon being slayed. It still plays out. Harry Potter's a great example, but it's so common even in modern times, right? This is the basic superhero narrative that we have today. And this gentleman, this scholar Joseph Campbell, actually did a great job of tearing it apart. He analyzed hundreds of different myths from all these different cultures, and he saw the same pattern, right? Where you essentially have have your hero who starts out at the beginning of these stories, and he sees something is wrong, he feels something's wrong, he's called out to action, goes out into the world, and goes into this ordeal, right? He's facing this monster. Usually he's almost defeated. You see this happen in every single action movie too, right, that you watch. Same exact thing. It almost doesn't work out for him. And then, he makes his way back afterwards, defeats the thing, and then somehow is acknowledged by the society, and the society grows forward. And then, of course, you can repeat this over and over again. You can have novels that go on for 8, 10, 20 books, right, of this same behavior happening. There's a new challenge that appears and so forth, right? Now, I think that, and Campbell did a great deal of work trying to understand why humans see it this way. And Carl Jung actually spent a great deal of time thinking about this as well. And I think that it comes back to answering that question that we set for ourselves at the beginning of this lecture, which was, why do we care about the stars? And why we care about the stars seems to be because they're able to exemplify the stories that we must tell. And why must we tell these same stories over and over again? And I think it comes back to that fundamental challenge of being a human, which is that every once in a while, in your perfect utopia, everything's going great. All of a sudden, you get an email that changes your life, or something happens to you. Right? You encounter something incredible or frustrating or terrible or cataclysmic, and you have to find a way through that, right? And the worst possible thing you can do in your own life is to just put that email away and forget about it, or just to move on from it. If you have something inside of you that's calling to your attention, right? It's calling you out, right? To pay attention to it. If you have a bad feeling about something, then the most important thing I think these myths are telling us is that you have to actually embrace that and run towards it and expose yourself to it, because you can't have those sorts of monsters just lying around in your room at all times, just hiding like in the corner, right? You have to take them on head first. So at any rate, I think that we do play these out in the movies today. Certainly literature played an enormous part of it, but in terms of having something like that to celebrate as an overarching moral guide, it seems to be somewhat lacking, and it's something to consider, because there's a lot of things we can probably all agree upon, regardless of our particular persuasions or interests. So, next week, I didn't get to the Mayans, sadly. Probably won't have time. But next week, we will continue the story as concerning ourselves with the birth of stars. But remember, when you look at those stars, there's more to them than the material significance of what's happening. It's very important we don't lose sight of the stories that our own ancestors, right, our own foreparents, right, the people whose flesh and blood we actually are of, that they had a very different take on these matters, and I think that it was equally as valuable. Anyways, I'll see you guys next week. Have a wonderful weekend.